Dr. Reza Janvidadi to welcome that professor and also to introduce her to us. And thank you, Reza. Thank you, Hartmut. And thank you, Warren Monty, for being with us.
Thank you, Grace, for organizing this event as always. Yes, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Setareh. We've known each other since the early 2010s when we, I think, worked on a film festival, one of two film festivals that I won an award in. I have very good memories of that festival. It was very big. We had many people from across the world, America and other places. So it was wonderful to see you there and see you work there, and especially in the last several years that you've become much more active, and your expertise you're sharing, and you're teaching at the University of Tehran, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and also you specialize in multiple languages and multiple regions, so America, South America, Latin America, Iran, West Asia, all of these countries. And from what I remember, you were fluent in Persian, English, and Spanish, unless you've learned another language in the last several years that I don't know about, maybe Portuguese or French or something. But mashallah, she's very talented. So it's wonderful to have you here. And I think it's lovely to have you because right now in this, well, it's not lovely to have you, but it's very pertinent to have you right now because a lot of stuff is happening in South America, which is really sad. What's happening with Venezuela and the United States threatening it. Obviously, Iran, we've discussed a lot on this podcast, myself and other guests, but we've never really had anyone to give us the expert opinion on South America. So it's something that we're really looking forward to learning from you. Warren is in Mexico, so he's kind of closer to South America. But I think because you visited recently as well, I wanted to really open up this discussion with you. And you've written many papers and presented many conferences. And we'll get to some of the stuff that you've discussed in your academic paper. But if you can just give us from your perspective of visiting Venezuela recently and engaging with Venezuelans on the floor in Caracas and other places, how, from what you understand, how do you think they see the threats of the United States of attacking that country, trying to take the resources of that country, trying to change the elected government and system of that country, as they've tried with many other countries? What's the view of the people that you met there towards that kind of attitude to their country?
Thank you for the invitation, and I must say I feel flattered for the introduction that you offered. I wouldn't consider myself a big expert on all the topics that you mentioned, but I'm trying to do my research. And since I come from Iran, I was born and raised here, and I've lived almost all my life here. I know how it feels to live under sanctions, under constant threats from the superpowers. And I know whenever I hear anything about countries that is loaded with negative words, with labels, I should question it, because as I said, I've lived the experience of talking to people from different parts of the world and finding them very, very misled and ignorant about Iran, which is not a intentional ignorance. It's because of all the propaganda that is put out by the imperial powers and their media in order to facilitate and justify aggression and warmongering on other countries. So coming from that background and knowing that probably everything that we hear about Venezuela from the mainstream media in the West is either the opposite or very different from the realities on the ground. I have kept in touch with my friends across America, Latin America, and as I said, and as you mentioned, I speak Spanish. 2 months. It was in October that I visited Venezuela, mainly Caracas, for a conference on colonialism and neocolonialism. While I was there, one of the U.S. illegal attacks on one of the fishing ships happened. And I should tell you that the vibes on the streets when I walked with my Venezuelan friends across the main square and different places, we drove across Caracas. I was surprised that normal life was not interrupted at all, and people were they had this strong spirit. I visited Simon Bolivar's uh, casa, which is the birth house of the revolutionary leader. And I saw many Venezuelans proudly sharing their feelings about about Simon Bolivar, and how he sets an example to resist imperialism and colonialism. People were happy, dancing and playing the music on the streets, which is the very Venezuelan spirit. And even though there are not many Muslims living there, and I clearly appear as a Muslim wearing the scarf, I was greeted by random people on the streets very warmly, just greetings, and I felt very welcome there. I walked to cafes and shops, and as I said, normal life had not stopped at all. The cafes and shops were full. Back in October, there was already Christmas vibes, so I cannot imagine how beautiful the vibes are right now in Caracas, which is very typical to Caracas. Like, Venezuelans like to start celebrating Christmas well before the actual date, and they get ready for that and in advance. And that spirit was not interrupted at all. Still, I talked to my friends just I think it was last week that I was talking to a friend in Venezuela, because no matter how well you know about what's going on there, when you constantly hear the news that the U.S. is going to attack Venezuela, and having seen the crazy warmongering nature of the U.S. government, you always get worried what's going to happen to the ordinary citizens, the people that you met and were living their lives there. And his answer was very interesting to me. He said, the Christmas vibes are definitely much stronger in Caracas right now than the fear of a war by the United States. And it's very similar to what I see in Iran. Back in June, when the Zionist regime and the U.S. attacked Iran during the 12-day war, I think it was Israel attacked Iran on June 13, and I was having a dinner at one of the popular neighborhoods in Esfahan, where I am from, with my friends and family, and we could even hear the defense system launching missiles after, about a 24-hour that it took Iran to start responding to the attacks. And the restaurants and the streets were packed with people celebrating the Eid that was back then, and family gatherings. Nothing was interrupted, and as I said, inside the restaurants we could hear that, but people felt very confident in their country's defense capabilities, and normal life was not really interrupted in Esfahan. I mean, in Tehran it was different because the attacks were mostly inside the city, not only military bases, and a lot of innocent people lost their lives. It was different, but still there. Normal life never stopped. So I find that very similar to what I hear and what I've seen in Venezuela, the spirits of resisting. And it does not mean that people are 100% happy with what is happening in their countries with their economy, which, there's no country in the world that would claim that's the case. If you hear that, you should start questioning if you are getting the truth out of that country. But it means that they understand that who the enemy is and who cares about them. They understand the solution to the problems that they're going through comes from within and not without, not from outside, not from the same countries that have been stealing their resources. I mean, look at Trump's rhetoric on Venezuela and its oil and resources. He talks as if he and the U.S. own Venezuela's rich oil resources, as if those are by default the US's resources, and the US has every right to take them back by any means necessary. It does not even matter if that means killing innocent people or fishermen on the boat. So, as I said, that I mean, one reason that I have been trying to do research with and compare the Iranian society with, for example, Cuban and Venezuelan society is exactly because we have all been target of the same sort of aggression and sanctions. I always say that when I talk to Venezuelans or Cubans, we share the pain and the suffering, but we also share the spirit of wanting to resist with anything that we can and not giving in to the imperialist ambitions that try to cripple our economy, that try to make it difficult for us to live, because just keeping up with the normal life is a form of resistance for us. Just trying not to interrupt or not to let the imperialist power to interrupt our ordinary or our normal life every day is a form of resistance. In Venezuela, I saw people in one of the main squares lining up to volunteer to defend their countries. And it was amazing for me. There were a lot of people, from men and women, young and old, that wanted to defend their country. And I think that's very beautiful. You see the same vibes with Iran, especially after the Israeli invasion of Iranian sovereignty. When you talk to people, no matter which, where on the political spectrum they stood, they wanted to defend their countries. And I think it's very important to remember that, because in this imperialist narrative, they want to show the Venezuelan society or the Iranian society as monolithic, as if there is not a variety of different ideas, because that simplifies and the stories that they want to tell about those countries in order to justify aggression, sanction, and against those nations. And yes, in Venezuela, probably not everyone thinks this. I mean, agrees with the government's policies, but they know that the U.S. does not care about them. They know that the U.S. wants their oil and their resources, and that the U.S. has a history of mass murder, of supporting, funding, and arming genocidal entities and armies. Yes, I think that's basically what I can tell you about my experience with Venezuela and Iran.
I'm interested to know, so from visiting Iran, obviously as Iranian myself, I've noticed that the sanctions coupled with the Iranian leadership's desire to develop industries and the needs of the country internally. So, for example, the automotive industry, I know that, it has areas that it can improve, but there's an automotive industry, a local one. When I go into a supermarket, every single thing that I can pick up from food products there's made in Iran. Sometimes I have Turkish and other ones, but there's, everything from, manufactured in Iran, to the ability to service aeroplanes for transport. So there is a industry, and especially the military industry, is able to produce military weapons that can defend the country. Did you find that in Venezuela, they have also taken this pressure of the sanctions, because they've been under sanctions for quite a long time, not as long as Iran, but quite a long time, to develop their own capabilities as well? Or is that something that they're still working on?
That's a very good question, because that's exactly one of the differences that I observed between Iran and Venezuela. So Venezuela is getting help from allies like China and Russia, who do not seek to subjugate the nation, but seek to, of course, invest and have a share and allow the Venezuelan people to have a share in those in their investment. Yes, there were a lot of Venezuelan products, like in supermarkets and different places that I went. But compared to Iran, it was different. And I think it is also something that they're working on, but it's also that the type of the sanctions that the US has imposed on Iran and on Venezuela are still, they differ in some areas. So sanctions have totally, for the past decades, cut Iran from the international market. And anything that you can see in like foreign products that come to Iran are usually not coming through the legal procedures. I mean, especially from Europe or America. And that's why it's almost impossible to see foreign products on the on supermarkets on the shelves. Um, it's also that Iran is, um, Iran has developed capabilities not only like as means to evade sanctions, but also as means to rely on its own capabilities in different sectors. To give you an example, probably, especially after the JCPOA, the what we know as the Iran nuclear deal, collapsed after the unilateral withdrawal of the United States government by Trump, the effects of sanctions got worse on Iran, and it's the need to develop, domestic products was felt stronger than before. But it did not start there. It has been there for a very long time, and Iran has worked on it for decades. Ever since we had the Popular Revolution in 1979 that overthrew the US installed dictator, we have faced sanctions, different sorts of sanctions, different levels of limitations on our economy. But since then, we have learned to rely on ourselves for different things, including military capabilities, as you mentioned. Iran right now produces, manufactures missiles that even the United States does not have. Iran manufactures drones for various reasons, not only military, that the US tries to copy and make similar to. And just thinking of a country that is able to do all these things despite sanctions, I think it's very impressive for anyone who understands how these sanctions have worked. There are many different sectors, but one of the sectors that I have talked about in a paper that I co-authored about sanctions on Iran and Cuba and how these created an economy of resistance, um, uh, is the home appliance sector. Like maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, all the home appliances that Iranian households uh, possessed were mostly not Iranians. There were either Chinese, Korean, German, in rare cases, American, Japanese. But right now, Iran-made home appliances are very popular. They have, in many different areas, replaced the foreign-made products, and people are happy with that. Of course, when first we had to, because we didn't really have another option, we had to use Iranian products. It took some years for them to improve, but right now you can get very good quality home appliances Iran made, and then a lot of people prefer that because it has better, for example, guarantees or services that they can use, and price wise it makes a lot more sense to buy the Iranian made ones than the foreign made ones. In cosmetics, in like medicine also, we have developed our own abilities, and um, we have reached above 80% self-sufficiency in many of those areas, which is again impressive. But I also, in the same article I have mentioned, and I think it's very important to mention that in the process of achieving this self-sufficiency, especially when it comes to medicine, there are people who die because of the sanctions. So when we talk about resistance economy, it does not, we're not trying to minimize the humanitarian impact of sanctions on ordinary citizens, because it does have an adverse impact. But what we are trying to focus on is that the objective that the imperialist power have in order to impose sanctions on independent nations is actually never achieved. As this scholar, Agata Damares, has argued in her book, Sanctions Backfire, um, she theorizes, based on evidence from many different countries, that if sanctions do not change the government or like force them to do what the imperialist powers want within a span of 2 years, it's never going to change. And imagine like Iran being under sanctions for decades, and the US has never achieved the objective that it wanted. Some sanctions on different countries in the history of sanctions have been effective in the sense that they have crippled the economy and made everyday life so difficult and miserable for ordinary citizens that they protested, and they asked, or they pushed their governments to surrender. So in some cases they could work, but for Iran it has not worked, and the results have been actually in favor of not only the government but also the people in the long run. And it's important to remember it's in the long run.
You said something interesting, that on some countries they had very detrimental effect, and I remember the sanctions of the 1990s on Iraq. Iraq didn't develop its own industries and its own capabilities to weather the sanctions, so the people really suffered. And was it Madeleine Albright, the Undersecretary or the Secretary of State or something, where when she was asked, what do you think about 500,000 Iraqi children dying because of your sanctions? She was like, yeah, no problem. She was not upset about it, killing 500.
It was worth it.
Children.
Yes.
This genocidal mentality of the US government isn't just Trump, isn't just Israel. It goes back a long history. When you were in Venezuela, did you see, because I remember before Iran promoting the idea of assisting Venezuela to have some kind of self-development, and they were trying to introduce Iranian cars and produce them in Venezuela and some other products and stuff like that. Did you see any so when you were there, did you see mainly Chinese products, Russian products? Did you see Iranian products? Or which country was the one that is most interacting with Venezuela to try and help develop it, from your experience when you were there? And then after that, I'll pass it to Monty so he can take the next question.
Well, in my experience, it was not very easy to pinpoint which country had the most products. Like, for example, in supermarkets, in different sectors that you would go. But in terms of construction and rebuilding the country and improving the infrastructure, I think China has the highest share in that, and it's very clear, and people know about it. Caracas appears as a developed capital city with good infrastructure, and a significant part of it has been with the help coming from China. But Iran also has helped with Venezuela's oil, so it's things that maybe you won't see as obvious as what China has done. You probably have heard about the Iranian supermarkets that exist in Caracas. I didn't go there, but it's there, and it's doing business, and people buy from that. But in general, I think it's you would say that it's mostly China that has been invested in Venezuela. And one reason is because China is not under the same sanctions as, for example, Iran. So it's a lot easier to get involved in another country and help them rebuild.
Monty, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, very pleased to join with you here, Setareh. I was looking at your page and your background. I'm very impressed, and thank you for being on with us today. They're going to great efforts in America to try to portray this national security strategy as a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is completely backward. The Monroe Doctrine was set up in 1823 for the purpose of reciprocal agreements with South America. In other words, to keep colonial empires, basically the British, the Spanish, the French, and the Portuguese, from recolonizing South America. And it was based on reciprocal agreements for trade, for development, and for protecting the Americas in order that they could rise up as the United States did and break free with colonialism. And it's really been, even in America, people are not familiar with this. And there was a man named Teddy Roosevelt that came in the early 1900s and completely turned the Monroe Doctrine on its head, which meant that America was going to have dominance and have the ability to punish countries that were a threat to this national security. And thereby, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine I'm seeing is really a Trump corollary to Teddy Roosevelt to reimpose imperialism. And really, what we see happening, what I'm seeing happening, and a few of my friends, is this really is what we're doing by imposing no-fly zones, uh, imposing a blockade on the Americas. The chickens are come home to roost, as Malcolm X said, and it really is an act of war. And I think people are reluctant to acknowledge this and try to put lipstick on a pig, so to speak, and try to make it something it's not. So what's your observation in Iran insofar as these type of actions of sanctions and no-fly zones being something that really is a hostile action?
You mean the no-fly zone over Venezuela, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in Iran, because we have been target of any sorts of U.S. aggression that you can think of, including sanctions, war, assassination, supporting so-called oppositions that in most cases appear to be terrorist organizations acting against the legitimate government or establishment in Iran. We feel the same pain. The rhetoric is different in the sense that in Iran, you have labels such as, an Islamist regime, or there is a degree of Islamophobia that seeks to dehumanize not only the decision makers, but also the society, the entire society. You can observe sort of the same rhetoric against Venezuela, but with different labels. For example, it's mostly about drug cartels, and no one talks about how the U.S. is one of the main sources of drug trafficking, and the U.S., for example, has the highest rates of drug addiction in the entire world, and how this is like a major issue in that country. As Venezuelan leaders put it, the cartel is in the north and not in the south. And so the excuses are different. For Iran, they keep saying it's the nuclear energy or the nuclear program. For Venezuela, they say, it's the drug cartels. But we find it very ironic and it gets to a point that it's more ludicrous and it sounds like a joke that the president of a country the president of the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons against another nation claims to be worried about the peaceful nuclear program that exists in Iran, despite all the international inspections. Obama bragged about how the so-called Iran deal, the JCPOA, imposed the most strict inspection regime on Iran's nuclear program. So the observations, the inspections that Iran agreed to within the framework of JCPOA were like no other treaties, and Iran allowed for inspections, which actually later led to facilitating the assassination of our nuclear scientists at the hand of Mossad. Seymour Hersh has an article back a few years ago. I don't remember the exact date. I think it was in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. But he talks about how during George Bush administration, Mossad and CIA worked together in Nevada to train MEK terrorists to assassinate nuclear scientists within Iran. And remember, that's before MEK was even delisted from the list of terrorist organizations by Europe and America. So this is the nature of the U.S. government. And even though some people may argue that it's worse, for example, during when Republicans are in power, I think it's just the rhetoric that is different. The mentality, the core policy that otherizes Iranian nation and Iranian political system is there. It's just the rhetoric that is different. Trump does not believe in political correctness, and he has said that. So it's like the naked form of core U.S. policy against other nations. It's the same mentality that everything in the world belongs to the U.S., and the U.S. has the right to take control of that by any means necessary, even if that means the killing of innocent people, the killing of children, the killing of people who do not even have any involvement in the in the political decision making or whatever policy that has been put forward. So the same is with Venezuela. I think in Latin America, it's probably maybe more difficult to see through that propaganda in terms of, because there are many countries in Latin America that, especially right now, are just acting on behalf of the United States. They're not resisting U.S. policies, but I think Venezuela and Venezuelan nation also understands, like the Cuban nation, despite all the difficulties that the sanctions are bringing to them, they have an understanding of how the U.S. does not care about them. In Iran, for example, I've talked to people who did not necessarily agree with the government, and they have many grievances that if they get a chance, they would take part in protests or voice their opposition. But when it comes to resisting U.S. imperialism, they do understand that the U.S. is not a friend. The U.S. does not care about Iranians. They understand the sanctions that have taken the lives of many Iranians, that have taken opportunities from many Iranians, especially Iranian women, are coming from the U.S. The U.S. is the reason for that. So while I think it has become more obvious and worse in terms of the apparent policies that the U.S. is putting forward during Trump administration, I don't see it as a new phenomenon. It's like looking at it from outside, I think Trump is just more straightforward about about what he wants to do with other nations, whereas, for example, Obama or the Democrats are more careful with choosing the words and framing it and then selling it to the American public, but also to the global public opinion.
Yes, just a quick follow-up. The president of Mexico recently came out in opposition to the intervention in Venezuela, and I'm thinking that perhaps she took to heart a quip that Henry Kissinger let slip a number of years ago, whereas he stated that it's dangerous to be an enemy of America, but to be America's friend is lethal. And I'm thinking perhaps that she's starting to get a clue that the BRICS nations in particular, they either going to hang together or they're going to hang separately. And by that, what I mean is I'm seeing these wars in Venezuela, these hostile actions, Venezuela, Iran, and even Ukraine, as not just being proxy wars for oil or minerals or against narco terrorism, but really what I'm starting to get a very clear sense of is this a war against the BRICS. In other words, this war against the idea of cooperative international development. And the BRICS nations right now, as you know, represent over 50% of the world's landmass and gross domestic product and quickly expanding. And the multipolar world and the hegemon of oligarchism and imperialism just can't coexist, and they recognize that. So I'm seeing that as perhaps a recognition by the other nations that this really is an attack on a sovereign alliance, on sovereignty for other nations, and they must really stand up against this at some point, against these types of threats. Do you see this similarly?
Yeah, exactly. I think what is happening within the United States system or the regime is we're seeing a declining imperialist power that would do anything to prevent, and any nation that can set an example of standing alone and resisting and not only surviving but thriving. And Iran is a very good example of that. Venezuela can become an example of that for Latin America. And I think President Sheinbaum is very smart. I'm really impressed with her policies because she's also one of the most, if not the most popular presidents that Mexico has ever had, and setting an example of not cooperating with the United States the way the United States wants, but still being very popular and designing policies that benefits the working class, that benefits the general public, is very impressive. And I think at some point, I'm sure Trump and the United States will try to you know, um, mess with Mexico because they're setting that example. But it's a very good example, and Mexico, I think, um, is setting a very good example for Latin America on how to like not become an ally, as you said, based on what Kissinger said, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's the history of America. Probably Zelensky in Ukraine also thought this becoming an ally of the United States and relying on the US was the way to survive and to, become accepted by Europe. But what we're seeing in Ukraine is that a lot of young people have died and they have also lost land. So this is what happens when you rely on the imperial power, because for the imperial power, I don't think alliance means anything. You are never an ally. It's actually you're either a client state or like a slave. Or you decide to resist, you're going to face a lot of difficulties, but you can survive. You will have your nation, even if it's going to be very difficult. And the same thing is happening in other parts of the world. You see in Africa, in West Asia, people pivoting to the East, nations pivoting to Russia and China in order to form alliances, because, as I said, even the way, for example, Trump receives European leaders in his office is very clear. I'm sure you've seen the viral pictures of Trump sitting and then the European leaders sitting as if they are like students that he is lecturing. even Europe is not seen by the United States president as an equal partner. And when there is not equal partnership, there is no alliance. You become a slave of the imperialist power. And the Iranian nation has totally understood that. I think Venezuela has understood that. And thankfully, the Mexican president has also understood that. And talking about Mexico, I think Mexico is one of the countries in Latin America that gives me a lot of hope. So far, the president has taken very legit stances against intervention in Venezuela, also Palestine and the genocide that we watched live stream in Gaza and Palestine, and that gives me a lot of hope in Latin America and especially Mexico.
So thank you very much. I'll pass it on.
Hartmut, you're next.
Yes, one moment. Now can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Now you can hear me, right? Brilliant. Professor Setareh, it's a pleasure talking to you here. And I want to come back to Taylor because I'm of the opinion that it's all about commodities, also with respect to BRICS, but in my opinion also with respect to commodities, because the problem is that the Americans want to lead the AI or AGI market in the world. And in order to get this done, there was the CEO of IBM, Mr. Ravin Kanash, well, not Mr. A moment, who was his name? The CEO of IBM stated that this is an $8 billion industry. And 1 gigawatt infrastructure, or AI infrastructure, costs $80 billion. And the interest rate annually would be 800 billion as well. So we talk about 8 trillion and 8 billion, 800 billion interest rate per year. And that this will never be profitable. The problem is that if someone wants to establish such a huge industry, you need access to the minerals. You need access to the oil. The oil is in Venezuela, copper, etc. And the triangle Bolivia, Argentina, and Brazil, they have 60% of the lithium resources. And Venezuela has also 50,000 50,000 tons of precious metals, which are useful for this industry. So, in my opinion, the Americans have no choice than getting access to these resources, because China is controlling 60 to 70% of the world market and 60 to 70% of all production facilities worldwide. So, do you think, and Trump sees that. Trump sees that he has to get access to the resources. Otherwise, the USA will go bankrupt. Do you agree on that?
Obviously, I mean, it's you mentioned lithium, but also other sources. I mean, for Trump, getting access to Venezuela's oil is very, very important, as you said, but also other resources across Latin America. And Venezuela has the highest oil resources of the entire world. It's a more difficult source of oil to extract and put it into use, but it has the highest oil reserves in the entire world. But the problem is, this is the difference between how China, for example, deals. I have criticism of China, especially when it comes to UN Security Council and the resolutions against the genocide in Palestine. But the way China sees the other nations is that, okay, you have these resources, I'm going to use your resources and I'm going to build infrastructure for you. But the way the US wants to deal with other countries is that, okay, Venezuela has the highest resources of oil, it's mine and I'm going to get it. And it doesn't matter what you think, I'm going to get it. It doesn't matter how. It doesn't matter how many people are going to die in the wars that I'm going to launch. I have to get access to that. And even though this worked for a very long time, it's a policy that is not being welcomed as much as it's once used to be welcomed right now, because countries are learning that there are other options. There was not the Chinese example back 50 years ago, but now people are learning that, okay, it's, yes, I have resources, but I can give it to countries in exchange for something that benefits my people, not just being like, plundering my resources in return for nothing, but also in return for the massacre of my people or the ethnic cleansing of my people. The same thing that some European colonial power did to Africa, and still some European countries are doing, or governments are doing to Africa. They never respected the agency of African nations or Latin American nations. They never respected the nations or consider their resources something that they could use as a way of establishing bilateral relations with other nations. The way they wanted to gain access to those resources was by framing them as others, as strangers, as aliens that need to be, like savages that need to be tamed, and people that are in need of a white savior to come and save them in order to be able to subjugate that nation and oppress them and finally gain access to their resources. So they were not willing to pay anything for what they could get out of those countries. And this has been problematic, but this is what is becoming more and more clear to the people of the world. So back then, maybe they said, okay, what is the other option? We don't have power to resist. We have to just accept and let them use our resources, and we don't have the capabilities. But now nations can see that there are other forms of engaging with other countries. There are other options. There are other countries that are willing to pay us something in return for the resources that they gain access to. So it's definitely also about gaining it. It's all about gaining access to resources. The war on Iraq was the same. The war in Afghanistan was the same. This, desire to engage in another war with Venezuela or with Iran is for the same reason: access to resources, access to oil, but also to the heartland, to where the geopolitics allows for more exploitation of resources of other nations around them. And it's such an old playbook that by now a lot of nations have discovered that the main reason is definitely not what the US is talking about, and it's about access to that nation's resources. So it's easier to resist it, and it's more difficult for the US to implement it the way they want it to, because it's going to have consequences for the United States too. Imagine the United States attacks Venezuela. They are already, the Trump administration is already launching a war against immigrants, even legal residents in the United States. Imagine they start a war and, Venezuela is not very far from the United States. It will create another wave of immigration that the US itself will have to deal with. Making the consequences of such an aggression more like heavier and more expensive for the United States is one reason that maybe there will be more resistance to that war from within the United States, like in Congress or in other like other politicians, not because they care about Venezuela, but because they know the consequences for the United States would be more grave than Trump, for example, himself thinks. They might try to prevent that.
Well, I think, unfortunately, more brutal. I think that the Western elite has learned that a fragmented country like Syria or like Libya is quite good for exploitation. And I suppose that this kind of exploitation they think they can do everywhere. So if they think that they can start a war in Venezuela, there will be not a government anymore. There will be territories which will be run by family clans or by mafia, and they know exactly how to manage these mafias and to pay the mafias in order to get the mining license, etc. And this is we see all over the place. It's the same, and this is okay. I'm maybe the one who has a theory, but it's the same with European Union. The situation is, for example, also with the Islam and, for example, with the immigration which we have in Europe right now. Interestingly, these people who come to Europe, they come from areas which were fragmented and destroyed by the Western first. You talk about Pakistan, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. So these people are completely traumatized. And if you get traumatized people with a belief system, which is, in this case, the vehicle is Islam to our country, then there is a potential of war. And in my opinion, it's also the same playbook like in Venezuela. Because if you have an economy crash, in that moment, the government is weak and mafia family clans will take over the power. And it's much easier, for example, to deal with a family clans according to Sharia law, and it doesn't care who will survive. And then, for example, to exploit the resources of Europe, because in UK, for example, you have 780,000 tons of lithium. In France, 400,000. In Austria, which is 12 million, and in Germany, 17 million tons of lithium. And if you understand, for example, Germany has, for example, increased its debt in February 2025 by 1,000 billion. And can you hear me? Because my thing is frozen. Okay. And 1,000 billion. And interestingly, the funds for military without limits. It's the exact playbook for Africa. The Americans went to Africa, gave a king millions of dollars. He bought houses, he bought yachts, planes, etc. Then they asked to pay back. He couldn't, and they got the mining rights. And this is what they do right now in Europe. So if you think 5 or 10 years ahead, of course, yeah. But this, and in Venezuela they have to go directly on war in order to get these things. And if China and Russia will protect Venezuela, then there is a possibility to stop this. Otherwise, South America will be taken by USA and the Western world.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Thanks for sharing your perspective. I think there are a few points that I want to make about that. I think the situation in Venezuela is very fragile. It's very difficult to say if a war is going to happen tomorrow or within a month, or if a war is actually going to happen or not. But what I'm referring to is that because this playbook has become very weary and people know about it, like politicians in the United States also know about it, there might be resistance. I mean, there has already been resistance from inside the U.S. government and Congress to prevent it. But even if that happens, it's not because they care about Venezuela or because they don't want to have excess on Venezuelan oil. It's because they know the consequences in the long run for the U.S. is also going to be adverse. You mentioned the issue of immigrants and what Europe is facing. I think it's when we look at the sources of the immigrations, but also terrorist activities that happen in the U.S. or in Europe in the name of immigrants or Muslim immigrants or immigrants. We go back to another playbook by the United States, which is funding, arming, and even being the ideological birth giver to those mentalities. And it's been always a tactic. Max Blumenthal has written a book called A Management of Savagery, which I really recommend to people to read, about the origins of ISIS, but also Al-Qaeda, and the relation the U.S. has with all those terrorist organizations, and how without the U.S. they would not even exist. So, and the U.S. exploited those terrorist organizations and funded them in order to implement its own imperialist objectives in different regions, including Syria, and it's still going on, but also in Europe and in America. But the problem is when you create terrorist organizations like that, or that mentality, then you cannot have full control over that. At some point, I mean, the same with the wars. You create the wars in the so-called Middle East or the West Asian region, and the consequences are not always going to be exactly what you were expecting to be. It's going to backfire at some point. And you made a very good point. The U.S. seeks a fractured and fragmented society in order to be able to manipulate and control. I think it's exactly the same. I mean, what they want for Iran is exactly the same. It's not even the Islamic Republic. It's Iran being a country 70 times bigger, more than 70 times bigger than the occupied territories now called Israel, with a population almost 10 times more than the terrorist regime's population. It's always going to be a problem. It's always going to be a bigger nation that the Israeli regime will have to fight in order to survive. Because when you steal land from another nation, when you base the ideology of your nation or your country on assassination, on terrorism, then of course it will have consequences for you. People are not going to stand idle and do nothing to fight back. So people will start to fight back. But I mean, unfortunately, that worked in Libya, that worked in Iraq, it worked in Syria. I think Syria is a very good current example of how the U.S. managed successfully to tear it apart, get access to its resources. And amazingly, a lot of people still do not understand. They cannot see through the propaganda that has brought Syria to what it is now. We have a head chopper president that was on the list of terrorist by CIA, but also worked with CIA. I mean, there are documents that show that Shara worked with American forces, and now he is the president and dressed up as a democratic, whatever you may call it, visiting the United States, appearing next to Trump, CIA bragging about how former CIA chief bragging about he is a fan of the same terrorist that is now the so-called president of Syria without any election, obviously. And it works. I mean, even before the fall of Assad's government, the U.S. had access to Syria's oil through these terrorist-controlled areas. Like 1/3 of the country was already occupied by terrorist factions that were supported by the United States. So yes, the playbook is there, the narrative is there. They have exploited Islamophobia, and they have used Islamophobia and many different forms of otherizing Venezuelans, Muslims, Iranians in order to successfully or try to successfully implement their agendas in these various countries. But what has changed, or at least is changing, is that it's becoming more clear. Take the case of the recent genocide in Palestine. It was not the first time that Israel was ethnic cleansing and carrying out a genocide against Palestine. Israel has been doing that for many years. The difference was it was the first time the world could watch it live streamed. So the social media that the same imperialist power created in order to further their own agenda, their own narrative, is being used by people to resist them. So the same thing can happen in other forms and other areas. Through the same alternative media, the same social media, people are raising awareness. What we're seeing inside the United States, for example, in terms of, for example, the younger generation resisting the Israeli lobby, or at least talking against it. I mean, they don't have the power to do anything because that system does not allow them, but at least they are protesting. They're showing that they don't care about, they care about their own country. They don't want another country, namely Israel, to control the politics of that country. This is something that you would not expect to happen 10 years ago. And social media is the same social media that is controlled by imperialist powers. The algorithm is totally manipulated. At the end of the day, can be used for raising awareness, and that's I think that's working. It's going to take a very long time, but it's working.
I see it a bit different because it was made public, like the president of Colombia said, so that every country could see what happens if you don't follow the playbook. And as we are, let's go to transhumanism, if a country wants to resist it, you can see Gaza will happen to you as well. And interesting is their psychological warfare. For example, in Guantanamo, I met a German professor who invented this kind of treatment in Germany for the good, but which was perversed by the military. For example, wearing gloves, wearing headphones, gas masks, and then kneeling very, very sharp white stones with the knees. So this is the famous picture of Guantanamo.
He started mentoring Guantanamo, and the CIA took it.
I don't know what happened, but
Before did you
maybe
something, Grace?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. Because, a lot of that, thank you so much for all of you. Because a lot of the topics and, explanations help me to understand the situation more. But at the same time, there are few points that it confuses me more. So it's very challenging. It's really a topic that challenges me so much. But I was wondering, but I'm in agreement. Like when for me, when Hartmut always mentions about the trauma, I don't know if there's any culture who hasn't been under such trauma. Okay, it could be in varying degrees. That the interesting thing is when, no matter, there are certain cultures, certain group of people that can just rise above those trauma. Okay, and that's, I think, most important to focus and to understand what. So like when Iran, China, Russia, also all the sanctions and all the limitations in the governance or in the limitations for those countries to have the self-sovereignty, but instead they became very sovereign. And also, for me, when I can see the economic situation of the citizens, that's for me a proof that, whatever they're doing something good. Then for Monty, I always heard that comment. The one that is different from what you always say is that to be a friend, to be an enemy of the deep state. That's what I hear. It's not to be an enemy of the United States, because it's widely known now that in every situation and every country, there's always a deep state. So to be a friend to be an enemy of the deep state is dangerous, but to be a friend is lethal. So I keep thinking that once you get pirated and you work for thinking that you will be in their side, but eventually you are disposable as well. And but since you mentioned, Professor Setareh, when you mentioned about Iran, about Russia and China, and recently Machado of Venezuela just had that interview in Face the Nation. And she did say that, and of course, there's an obvious rivalry between Maduro and her. And she said, well, right now, Maduro has the support of Russia and Iran. So that said, with that thought, if Maduro, if the current leadership in Venezuela has that support, so what's your thought on how Machado will be able to lead? If he successfully influence his country to be in a position that could really maintain its sovereignty, because there are commentaries from the mainstream, and especially also in the alternative media, that she's okay to invite war, to even invite Trump to attack Venezuela. So I thought you could help us understand more on what might happen. Then we all from the very beginning, I understand that it's not totally about the oil, because even before Chevron has already that access. Okay, so but could it be more than that? Could also connect it to the maritime power on the way, the tankers and all that connects, and maybe it connects to Iran, to Israel, because when one issue happens, it's impossible that there's no connection to it. So, and however you want to share.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't call I don't see Maduro and Machado as rivalry, the thing that is between them, because it's not a competition. It's an imposition from outside, the way Machado wants to get involved in Venezuelan politics. There was an election, there were international observers, and the election was won by Maduro. So she has already lost the competition, but because she wants to play the agenda that has been assigned to her by America, she poses as the opposition leader. But I don't think there is a rivalry in the sense that Maduro has the Venezuelan public support, but Machado does not. And the reason is that Machado talks about how it's evil to have Iran or Russia involved in the Venezuelan politics, but she welcomes the U.S. invasion of of Venezuela. She even talked in one of the interviews that she did online. She even talks about how if she becomes the president, she will allow U.S. companies without any, without even having to pay to use Venezuela's oil, like calling different international companies to exploit Venezuela's oil without having any impact for or benefits for the Venezuelan nation, obviously. So for me as an Iranian, this is a very old story, because I have always heard about these so-called Iranian opposition leaders. One being, for example, the son of the ousted dictator. I mean, the dictator was himself hated by Iranian nation, and then his son has barely lived in Iran. He does not even understand the current Iranian society. He makes very stupid comments when it comes to Iran, because obviously he has been far from the country for almost 50 years. Living on the money that he and his family stole from Iranians when they fled the country after, the popular revolution in 1979. And it just reminds me of, Machado reminds me of him and of other so-called opposition leaders, Iranian opposition leader. The other famous one is actually the head of the notorious terrorist cult, the MEK, that has assassinated more than 21,000 Iranians, and Iranians from any political inclination, from any ideology, hate this terrorist organizations. But from like the Western powers that try to fund them and promote them do not understand the Iranian society. They do not understand that these figures do not have any support in Iran. So the same, you could argue, I mean, it's there are differences, but you could argue the same thing for Machado. And no matter how Venezuelans agree or disagree with Maduro and his policies, they understand that Machado is an agent of the imperialist power and does not seek to bring democracy, for example, for Venezuela, or to improve the life of the ordinary citizens. Usually these oppositions live a life that is very different from the ordinary citizens. Like they're living on the money that has been provided to them by the imperialist powers. They do not have any understanding of the sufferings of the ordinary citizens, be it the sanctions or the domestic policies or whatever that is, because they live far from that. If they are inside the country, they're sheltered, they're protected by their patrons that are usually outside the country. And if they're outside the country, obviously they live in their mansions that have been provided to them by for example, the U.S. Government. So it's Maduro's support, or whether he survives in power or not. I don't think it depends on Russia or China's support. I think it mostly depends on whether the Venezuelan public will support him or not. As long as Maduro has Venezuelan support, no other country can really overthrow him. Or if they do, they're going to have a very difficult job. So I mean, you can argue the same thing with Iran and Iranians. As long as the Iranian establishment enjoys public support from within, no other country can overthrow the government. They can try. They can inflict harm, they can impose sanctions, they can threaten, but the results are going to be very different. That's something that we saw happen in Syria. As Assad lost public support, it became easier to overthrow him. But if you still enjoy a significant degree of popularity within the country, it's going to be very difficult for the imperialist powers to try to overthrow you.
Thank you, Professor. And another question is that for 2026, what do you look forward in terms of what's going on in Iran and what's going on in relationship also again in Venezuela, and particularly in what's happening with like wars here and there. And because if I just hear all what America or the deep state has done, and the Western hegemony, the Western empire, whatever you call it, it's like and I live here now in like inside United States. It feels like I cannot see like a little hope there, or a little beautiful rainbow there. So, but as um, as an expert from Iran, can you share us what your vision for?
Well, I can. I think I can talk about what I vision for Iran. But also with regards to what's happening in the United States. We're going through very dark days in the world, because we, as I said, we watched a live stream genocide in Palestine without us ordinary citizens being able to do anything to prevent, and the leaders of the major powers or other countries did not want to do anything to prevent, and the United Nations basically could not do anything when when you have a system that is that has an unfair like voting system, the veto power. As long as the veto power exists, we're not going to have a united nation that actually works for the benefit of ordinary people. It's going to be a power play between major powers and whatever they want. There is always the veto power. Nations are not considered equal within that system, and their powers are not considered equal. So it's going to be very difficult to have any hope in that. And as long as Trump is in office, and as long as the political system in the United States lives on staging war here and there, I don't think we can have any hope for the world. But on the other hand, as I have said, I think we are seeing an unprecedented global awareness sweeping the entire world. It's slow, but it's happening, and it's not only a beautiful thing, but it's also something that gives us hope and reminds us that no matter how small our actions might look to us, they're going to bring about a major change in the future. And my hope is mostly on what people can do, especially like the working class people, the oppressed people. Just the example of Palestine, it's true that many innocent lives have been lost, that the entire Gaza Strip has been turned into ruins. But just watch how these people, how continued living in the destroyed areas, and they refused to leave their country because they wanted to resist occupation and genocide, because they wanted to resist imperialism and colonialism. They lost their children. Many people lost many members of their families. They faced starvation. They faced bombs on their hospitals, on incubators, on mosques, schools, houses, but still they did not give up, and they wanted to protect and save their land from falling into the hands of the agents of the imperialist power. And I think that beautiful example has been set for all of us across the world, and it's waking up a lot of people, and that's what I have hope in. And I think that's going to bring about more changes in the world. It's going to make it a tiny bit, even if that's it, a tiny bit more difficult for imperialist power and aggressors.
But a lot of stuff that we discussed. I think we only have a few minutes left. We talked about trauma, which is interesting because I remember in the 1980s, especially around 1984, when I lived in Tehran during the Iran-Iraq war, that the Iraqis started to bomb the cities. It was called the War of the Cities. because the Iraqis realized, Saddam Hussein realized he can't win the war. So he wanted to demoralize the population. So they put pressure on the government. So the government just says, okay, ceasefire, everyone back to the same borders. But what happened was we would go into the basement of the house that we lived in just to get away from bombs. And we would hear the sirens and the planes. And I remember my dad putting the tapes on the window, so if they break, they don't shatter onto us and stuff like that. So I remember that trauma. And as a child, because I was 6 years old, it will always stick with you, and it goes into your long-term memory. The 12 days that they attacked Iran. So you talked about the beginning, people in the restaurant, normal, everything. For the 12 days, could you just briefly just tell us how the population dealt with the 12 days? Like, because no one knew it was going to be 12 days. People thought it might be into months and, weeks and months and so forth. What was the morale of the people? You said you were in Esfahan. So if you could talk about Esfahan, maybe if you had friends in Tehran, how they, what they told you about. When I went to Iran in September, I didn't really see remnants of it. Obviously, there was buildings that were damaged in places, but when I was going through normal parts of Tehran, I didn't see any damages. Could you, so you can tell me what the morale was like towards the end of the 12 days? Were people still supportive of the war and defiant, or was it they were getting a little bit, worried and scared?
I think it was a combination of both. People were worried, they were scared how long this war is going to take. Are they going to target more, civil areas and civil targets inside different cities, or is this going to remain in like military bases? Because as I said, in Esfahan, it was mostly research centers and also military bases, but in Tehran, it was inside the city. And I kept in touch with my friends because I mainly work and live in Tehran. That's where my job is. And the neighborhood that I lived in, like near the neighborhood, which is mostly a university neighborhood, was targeted. We were like with my friends and colleagues, we would keep in touch every day and talk about it, and we were worried, but um people would get together. I feel, and this is what I have also heard from a lot of people, that people were much kinder to each other. Like, they went to their works, and you know trying to care for the loved ones, for their colleagues, for the people, for the random strangers on the streets more than before. And this was one of the most beautiful things that I experienced during those days. And because of what I have studied, I would get a lot of questions from people. Do you think this is going to last for long? What do you think it's going to happen? And we always had this discussion, which is like, very typical of Iranian gatherings. You start talking about politics and economic even. It's like the dinner table conversation every day, but people did not stop going to their gatherings, visiting their families, going to cafes. I remember one day after the war, I went to this cafe in Esfahan, a very beautiful place, packed with people, and I asked the waitress, was it always packed like this, or did it stop during the war and then started to get packed? And she said, we had fewer customers for only one day, but then the entire 12, like 10 other 11 days, we did not have a change in the number of customers we were receiving. So that's how people dealt with it. That's how people were, okay, if anything is going to happen, we're all united, we're going to resist, and we're going to push back. We have lived through 8 years of war. Right after we went through the revolution, so our new establishment, our new government and political system was just being formed, and we were attacked, and the entire world was against us. And we, at that time, we did not have anything, like no capabilities. We were just building a new country, and still we managed to defeat Saddam's the regime, and we managed to protect our borders. And now we are far stronger than what we were before. So we're going to manage it. We're going to survive, and we're going to defend our country. Of course, at times, especially the first 24 hours was very scary. A lot of people, because we were kind of caught by surprise, because we were in the middle of negotiations with the United States when they attacked us, right? So it was pretty much unexpected. But within 24 hours, we gained back. And on June 14 or 15, I think, I saw people on the streets cheering for the defense system and the military on like fighting back. And people were, we would go to the rooftops and watch the missiles go toward the occupied territories. And that was like one of the most exciting and most beautiful things. So this is how people reacted to what was happening those days.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Unless Monty, you have any final comment, we can wrap it up.
Yes, I was. I'm always going back and thinking about root cause. You know, I mean, as I said, I recognize these wars that we're involved in are really uh, appear to be against the BRICS nations. But even behind that, the idea of the BRICS is based on the BRICS really represents this idea of cooperative development. And development really is the name for peace. In other words, the idea of human beings being able to be fruitful, to multiply, to uplift the earth. And everything is downstream from culture in that respect. I think that Russia, when you look at it, they have 140 different ethnic groups, and they seem to be able to cooperate and get along. I mean, Putin has an 80% approval rating. You look at the West, for instance, Trump, his approval rating has dropped from 40% amongst the independents to 4%. In other words, he's not living up to his commitment to end these perpetual wars. You look at the collective West nations like the UK and Germany and France, the approval rating of their leaders is almost in the single digits. So it's not consensus of the people that they're still ruling. It's just by arbitrary power. And getting back to this idea of root cause, I think everything is downstream from culture. In other words, a culture that's based on the idea of human beings being made in the image of God, and God being the principle of truth, of beauty, of justice. Whereas amongst the hegemons, they kind of look at themselves as being gods, and human beings as just being cattle or talking cattle. And when there's too much population or there appears to be too limited resources, rather than what they do is they want to cull the flock, depopulate the earth, and rule over them arbitrarily. So I think this thing of the commonality of cultures and religions that believe in overall goodness and uplifting humankind, I think everything is downstream from that. In other words, everything is downstream from culture. And the commonality of religions that believe in we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, provide for the common defense, and provide for the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Those are really the roots of what made America. Unfortunately, we've turned from that, and I'm hoping that we can rise from the ashes, so to speak, and embrace our common heritage amongst human beings. And I think Russia and China are really proof of principle for that. If you look at the last 20, 25 years, look at what they've built and look at what they've done insofar as increasing the betterment of their people, the increase in literacy rates, the massive development of infrastructure and technology, as opposed to the West, who seem to be committing suicide on the installment plan and their culture is going to hell. So there really seems to be an end times fight right now over what the world will look like. And I think it's inevitable that we, the people, and the ideas of sovereignty and goodness and justice and of truth is really coming to the fore. The danger is that the madness amongst these people and their fury could cause a lot of destruction in their when they go down with their demise. So that's some of my comments, and I wonder if you might reflect on.
Any final comments from you, Professor?
That's a very good comment you made, and I want to say, coming from a city in Iran, I live in Esfahan, where we have more than, I think, 10, 11 active churches and a few active synagogues. Like, I walked to this just a couple of days ago in Tehran, but they also live in Esfahan. I walked into this Jewish shop that sold, Jewish symbols and antiques. Very nice people, Jewish backgrounds that have actually were originally from Esfahan, and I could tell from their accent. And we had a very friendly conversation. And in Esfahan, I worked in a Christian neighborhood for many years, and I had Christian students and Muslim students. We never even asked about our religion, and we know we have always respected each other and lived in peace for hundreds of years together. Like in Tehran, the municipality recently opened and added a new subway stop that is called Saint Mary, and it's across from one of the main churches in Tehran. And I know this is something that for a lot of people in the West is like shocking. What? There are Jews and Muslims in Iran? There are like churches and synagogues in Iran? But yes, they are. And they have been there for many years, and still like Jews have representatives in the Islamic parliament, and Christians also have their representatives. And um, we have never had problems with each other. We have lived together, and we also have many different ethnicities. And the idea of like putting God above everything and staying true to our morals and humanity has always been the core principle in what the Islamic Republic had promoted as an ideology to shape your politics around our politics around it, and especially justice in Islam, but particularly in Shia Islam, is very central. We remember Imam Hussein as our third Imam and the grandson of the Prophet, as giving his life because he wanted to establish justice, and he knew he would lose his life, the life of his companions, his family and friends, and that his family would be held captive for many years, and it would be a very difficult battle. But because justice stands above, he said, I will sacrifice everything that I have, but I will, set this lesson for the generations to come, that justice is the most important thing. And if you even don't have religion, if you are a free person, you will stand for justice and you will care for justice. So we as Iranians have been raised with that mentality and with that notion. And justice can start from your like dinner table, how you distribute food between different people, but it can get to more greater causes and the international in the international arena, where you stand and your dignity as an equal partner and engaging with other nations as being equal with everyone is central to how we view the world and how we want to act and behave as humans.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was
Thank
a
you.
nice note to wrap everything up
No
on.
problem.
just to say that we discussed the ideas of U.S. hegemony and empire, and how resistance is far lesser to pay than if you submit to empire and oppression, and that all religions encourage justice and all people seek justice and freedom. And that's something I think the whole world is going towards to, and unfortunately the world is held captive by a small group of elite who sacrifice innocent people, as they have in Ukraine and Iraq and Syria and other places, to achieve. But I think the world is going towards and I've mentioned this, I think, previous podcast that I was in, going towards a enlightenment stage where when the injustice is so much that the savior that we as Muslims believe, Imam Mahdi, and the Christians, the Messiah that we all believe in, will come back and fulfill the justice that God has promised us. So hopefully by then the Islamic Republic and Venezuela will continue fighting and resist the US Donald Trump and his allies or his lackeys, the Europeans. But thank you so much, Grace. I'll pass it back to you, and thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you, everyone. And Professor, can you invite them to where they can connect with you, your best contact?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. And people can follow me or message me on X, formerly known as Twitter. And I think you can share with them my Twitter handle, but I can also spell it. It's at Leelako, Leelako.
Yes, thank you. I have that printed. And so, well, everyone be blessed and continue to do your own role, your good role, so that we could co-create a new positive history for us. And yes, I also believe that understanding each other culture, but begin with yours, is so much important. I used to tell my friends before I left the country 4 years ago that as long as one understands your culture, you can handle anything outside your motherland. So take care. This is Grace Asagra of Quantum Nurse Freedom International, and be well. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.